The UFC is built on power. The biggest, strongest, and most athletic fighters usually rise to the top. Heavyweights crush opponents with one punch. Middleweights tear through their division with size and reach. Even in the lighter weight classes, champions tend to have some kind of overwhelming physical advantage, whether it is freakish knockout power, insane speed, or sheer size. But then, there's Frankie Edgar. At just 5'6", he was one of the smallest UFC champions in history. And unlike most lightweights, he didn't cut massive amounts of weight to gain an edge. He wasn't draining himself to make 155, then rehydrating back up to 175 on fight night. He was walking into the cage as a true lightweight, going up against guys who were basically welterweights by the time the fight started. But that didn't stop him. When he faced Penn, people thought he had no shot. Penn was the greatest lightweight in the world, maybe even the greatest of all time. He had destroyed every challenger the UFC threw at him. Frankie wasn't supposed to win that fight, but he did. And then he did it again. Then came Maynard, the human wrecking ball. He was bigger, stronger, and had already beaten Edgar once before. In their rematch, Maynard knocked Edgar down 4 times in one round. No champion had ever survived that kind of beating. The commentators were calling for it to be stopped. The referee was inches away from stepping in. Somehow, Edgar survived. Not only did he survive, but by the time the fight ended, he made a comeback so insane that fans still talk about it today. This isn't just a story about wins and losses. It is a story about heart, a story about refusing to quit no matter how bad things look. This is the story of the legend, Frankie Edgar. Now, Frankie wasn't supposed to make it in MMA. He didn't come from a flashy background. He didn't have a huge wrestling pedigree like an NCAA champion or Olympic medalist. He wasn't some phenom with insane knockout power or a submission game that sent guys tapping in seconds. He was just a tough, scrappy kid from Toms River, New Jersey. Frankie grew up in a town that produced more wrestlers than boxers or brawlers. Wrestling was everything in Toms River, and that's where his journey started. He wrestled all through high school and then continued in college at Clarion University. He wasn't a national champion, but he was a grinder. He had that relentless, never-quit attitude that made him a nightmare to deal with on the mat. That work ethic was what defined him. He wasn't the strongest, the fastest, or the most explosive, but he refused to get outworked.
Like, one of the more impressive guys in the UFC for me has always been Frankie Edgar, because that guy's just a product of hard work. He's never been a knockout puncher. He's not the biggest guy. He's always been small for whatever division he's in. And he's small at 55, and he's pretty small at 45 in comparison to some guys like Ortega we fought this weekend. Right. Brian's much bigger than him, taller, longer. He's just all heart and will and toughness, and I love that. And I think that's an admirable thing, and I think you can get a lot out of watching a guy like that.
After college, he didn't know what was next. There was no pro wrestling career waiting for him, no Olympic aspirations, but that is when he found MMA. Back then, the UFC was not what it is today. It wasn't a billion-dollar business with ESPN deals. Fighters were not making millions. For Frankie, fighting wasn't about money. It was about proving himself. His early MMA career was not glamorous. He fought in tiny venues in front of a handful of people. There were no big walkouts, no fancy production, just a cage, 2 fighters, and a referee. But the biggest challenge for him was his size. He wasn't a natural lightweight. Most guys in the division cut down from 170 or even 180 pounds. Frankie, he was barely above 155 on fight night. But that never stopped him. His wrestling gave him an edge. But it wasn't just about takedowns. He mastered the art of movement, constantly circling, never standing still, never giving bigger opponents a stationary target. His footwork was like a boxer's, darting in and out, setting up angles before they could plant their feet and fire. He made up for the size disadvantage with speed and volume. He wasn't a one-punch knockout artist, but he threw in bunches. jabs, crosses, feints, always touching, always keeping his opponents guessing. And when they tried to counter, he'd level change in an instant, mixing in his wrestling to keep them off balance. On the ground, he wasn't overpowering, but he was relentless. He scrambled like his life depended on it, refusing to accept bad positions. He would shoot for a takedown, chain it into another, and if that failed, he'd just keep moving, never letting the bigger guys settle or impose their strength. His cardio was ridiculous. He could push a pace that most guys couldn't keep up with. He didn't slow down. He didn't gas out. If a fight went to the later rounds, he got stronger while the other guy faded. It didn't take long for people to notice. He got his first real shot in the UFC in 2007. The call came for UFC 67, and he was matched against Tyson Griffin, an absolute powerhouse with an impressive record. Everyone thought Frankie was too small, too inexperienced. They were wrong. He stepped into the octagon and put on a show. He outworked Griffin in a back-and-forth war that ended with him surviving a deep knee bar in the final seconds. Somehow, he didn't tap. Joe Rogan couldn't believe it. The fans couldn't believe it. Frankie Edgar had arrived. From that moment on, the fans realized he was a problem. By 2010, the UFC lightweight division was ruled by one man, BJ Penn. BJ was the lightweight at the time, and for many, the best to ever do it at 155 pounds. People talked about him like he was unbeatable. His boxing was elite, his jiu-jitsu world class, his takedown defense nearly impossible to break. And at the time, it wasn't just about who BJ was beating, it was how he was doing it. He ran through Sean Shirk, destroyed Kenny Florian, humiliated Diego Sanchez in a fight so one-sided that Diego looked like he had been in a car crash by the end of it. Frankie Edgar was next in line. Nobody gave him a chance. The odds makers had BJ as a massive favorite. Analysts said Edgar was too small, too weak, too inexperienced. It wasn't just the size difference. It was everything. BJ Penn had been fighting legends for years. Edgar was still the scrappy underdog winning fights with his insane pace and wrestling. On paper, this fight wasn't close, but fights aren't won on paper. April 10th, 2010, UFC 112 in Abu Dhabi. Frankie Edgar stepped into the cage against a man who had never lost at lightweight, a man who had embarrassed everyone before him, and he outworked him. Where many thought Frankie wouldn't even survive, he not only survived, he took the fight to BJ. His movement was insane. He never stayed in one spot. He was in and out, constantly circling, constantly frustrating Penn. BJ couldn't find his rhythm. For 5 straight rounds, Edgar kept the pressure on. He mixed in takedowns, sharp boxing, and relentless pace. By the end of the night, BJ looked tired. Edgar looked fresh. Then Bruce Buffer read the scorecard.
And new UFC lightweight champion of the world.
Frankie had done the impossible. He was the new lightweight champion. But people still doubted him. They called it a fluke, said that BJ had an off night, claimed that Edgar didn't really beat him. So the UFC ran it back. 4 months later, they meet again at UFC 118. And this time, Edgar proved all the doubters wrong when he not only beat BJ, he dominated him. 5 rounds, no controversy, no doubt. He was faster, sharper, and completely shut Penn down. It was official. The answer had arrived. But his toughest test was still ahead. Winning the belt is one thing, but keeping it is an entirely different ballgame. Edgar's first title defense was against the only man who had ever beaten him, Maynard. Maynard was huge for the division, a powerhouse wrestler who cut a ton of weight, rehydrated, and stepped into the cage looking like a welterweight. His style was simple, but brutal. He would smother guys, drag them to the mat, and grind them down until they broke. And when he fought Frankie Edgar for the first time in 2008, that is exactly what he did. He ragdolled him, out-wrestled him, shut him down completely. So, when the UFC booked Edgar vs. Maynard 2 for New Year's Day 2011, most people expected history to repeat itself. What they didn't expect was one of the most insane fights in lightweight history. The fight started fast, and within the first minute, disaster struck for Edgar. Maynard landed a bomb of a left hook, and Frankie's legs buckled. A brutal uppercut followed, sending Edgar crashing to the mat. He tried to get up, but Maynard swarmed him, landing another massive right hand that sent him stumbling again. A second uppercut floored Edgar, and for a moment, it looked like it was over. But somehow, he got back to his feet, only for Maynard to land a final right hand that sent him down a fourth time. Nobody had ever seen a UFC champion take that kind of damage and survive. The commentators were losing their minds. Joe Rogan was yelling that the fight was over. The referee just inches away from stopping it.
Who reffed those fights?
Yves Levine.
Both of them?
No, the first one.
The first
second one I think was Josh Rosenthal.
Well, shout out to both of those guys.
Yeah.
Because a trigger-hungry referee who's got an itchy trigger finger, they would have stopped those fights.
Now, I think nowadays someone might stop it.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
back then I feel like they let it go a little more. I mean, of course, there's still sometimes they let it go a little
It
too
all
long now. It
changes.
depends, you know.
never know. You never know. It all changes. It's such a weird thing, right? It's like the referee is trying to help the fighter. They're trying to make sure that the fighter doesn't take unnecessary damage. But, you know, more than once you see fights stopped where you're like, oh, that guy wasn't done.
Right.
He was getting through a...
And somehow, some way, Edgar made it out of the round. Now, most fighters would have been done. Their bodies would shut down. Their minds would give in. But Frankie Edgar wasn't most fighters. He came out in the second round like nothing had happened. He started moving again, using his speed, landing crisp combinations, mixing in takedowns. And suddenly, Maynard wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the one getting frustrated. By the third round, Edgar had completely flipped the fight. By the fourth, he was outworking Maynard. And by the fifth, he was in full control. When the final horn sounded, nobody could believe what they just saw. It was a draw. Frankie kept his belt, but there was unfinished business. The UFC had no choice. They had to run it back again. 10 months later at UFC 136, Frankie and Maynard met for the third and final time. This time, there was no early knockdown, no near finish, but there was a definitive ending. Frankie absorbed big shots again, but he refused to be bullied. He stayed in Maynard's face, forced him into wild exchanges, and in the fourth round, he got his revenge. A perfectly placed right hand rocked Maynard. Edgar pounced. A flurry of punches followed, and Maynard crumbled against the cage. Frankie Edgar, the undersized champ, had just knocked out the biggest lightweight in the division. The war was over, and Edgar's legacy as one of the toughest champions ever was officially set in stone. Now, Frankie Edgar was a different kind of champion. The UFC lightweight division had always been filled with killers, huge guys cutting from 170, physically imposing, dominant fighters who use their size as a weapon. Frankie flipped the script. He wasn't cutting massive amounts of weight. He wasn't bullying guys with power. He was winning with skill, with speed, with heart. After the Maynard trilogy, Frankie was finally recognized as one of the best lightweights of all time. But his reign didn't last long. Next in line was Benson Henderson, another massive lightweight, 5'9", shredded, and built like an action figure. A guy who looked like he belonged in the welterweight division. Their first fight at UFC 144 was a war. 5 rounds, non-stop action. Frankie had his moments landing clean combinations and mixing in takedowns, but Henderson was landing the bigger shots. A brutal up kick in the second round nearly changed the fight. Frankie kept coming forward, but the damage added up. The judges gave it to Henderson. Just like that, Frankie was no longer champion.
Again, I'm not a judge, and my opinion doesn't matter, but I had it even going into that last round. and I gave the last round to Frankie.
So were you at all surprised when the judges scored it? Some of them, I believe, 4-1 for Benson Henderson.
Yeah, that's crazy. I mean, most of the judges had him losing the last round. I don't know how you have him losing the last round. Well, I was on Twitter going into the third, fourth, and last round asking people how they had it, and there were some people that had it just like I had it. There were other people that had it the other way for Henderson, and I said, get ready.
But in classic Frankie Edgar fashion, he refused to accept defeat without a rematch. They fought again 6 months later, and this time it was even closer. Frankie outworked him, landed more shots, took him down. But once again, the judges gave it to Benson. 2 razor-close fights, 2 decisions that could have gone either way. But Frankie Edgar was no longer the king of the lightweight division. For most fighters, losing back-to-back title fights would be a sign to step back, to rebuild. But not Frankie. Instead, he made a move that shocked everyone. The writing had been on the wall for years. Frankie was giving up too much size at lightweight. He had proven he could hang with bigger guys, even beat them. But after back-to-back losses to Henderson, reality set in. The division was evolving. Top contenders were getting even bigger, stronger, and cutting more weight than ever before. Frankie wasn't just fighting skill anymore, he was fighting physics. So when the UFC offered him a fresh start in a different weight class, he took it. He decided to drop down to featherweight. For years, people had been saying it, Frankie Edgar was just too small for lightweight. Even when he was champion, he was the only guy in the division not cutting weight. Every fight, he was stepping into the cage against monsters who had rehydrated, 15, sometimes even 20 pounds overnight. So after losing the lightweight belt, he finally made the move. And he didn't take an easy fight. No tune-up, no warm-up. Frankie Edgar's first fight at featherweight? Jose freaking Aldo. Now, Aldo was the featherweight at the time, a dominant, undefeated champion, a guy with nuclear leg kicks and knockout power, and Frankie was stepping into a new division against the champion. UFC 156. It was another classic Edgar fight. Tons of movement, constant pressure, mixing and takedown attempts with sharp boxing, but Aldo was just too much. The leg kicks took a toll. The power difference was real. And after 5 rounds, for the 3rd time in a row, Frankie lost a close decision. But here's the thing about Frankie Edgar. He doesn't break. Most guys after losing 3 straight title fights would never get back to the top. Frankie instead went on a tear. He fought and dominated some of the best featherweights in the world. He choked out Cub Swanson in the final seconds of the fight. He outclassed Uriah Faber. He absolutely wrecked Chad Mendes in one of the best performances of his career, knocking him out cold in the first round. By 2016, Frankie was back in title contention. And for the second time, he faced Jose Aldo. It was the same story. Frankie fought his heart out, but Aldo was just too sharp. Another 5-round decision loss. And that fighting, he kept winning. But then came the Brian Ortega fight, UFC 222. For the first time in his career, Frankie Edgar got knocked out. And it wasn't just a loss. It was brutal. A huge uppercut from Ortega put him down in the first round. Frankie, the guy who had taken bombs from Gray Maynard and survived, was out cold. It was the beginning of the end. Frankie moved down again, this time to bantamweight. At 135, he was finally fighting guys his own size. And in his debut, he looked great. A razor-close win against Pedro Munoz. It was classic Frankie, relentless pace, sharp boxing, and insane durability. He edged out Munoz in a split decision, showing that he could still compete with the best. But then, reality set in. Corey Sandhagen knocked him out with a flying knee, a brutal highlight reel finish that left Frankie stiff before he even hit the ground. Marlon Vera knocked him out with a front kick, a devastating shot that came in the 3rd round, right when it looked like Frankie might take the decision. 1 second he was moving, The next, his face was contorted in one of the most painful knockouts you'll ever see. Chris Gutierrez knocked him out with a knee in his farewell fight. A tough way to go out, but against a younger, faster opponent, Father Time had caught up to Frankie.
In the sport, you got to be proud. You're a lightweight champion. You fought the best of the best throughout your career, and millions of people around the world love you.
I love this sport, man. I didn't want to go out like that. This sport's a you know. I got my family here. That's all that matters.
You will go on, and what made you a champion in this, you could be a champion in anything you put your mind to. I 100% believe that.
Frankie Edgar was one of the toughest champions in UFC history, but he had finally reached the end. After 36 fights, multiple title reigns, and years of fighting absolute killers, he retired in 2022. The UFC will never have another fighter like him. Think about it. This was a guy who spent his entire career fighting men who were bigger, stronger, and heavier than him. And yet he didn't just survive, he won. BJ Penn was supposed to destroy him. Edgar beat him twice. Maynard dropped him 4 times in 1 round. Edgar came back and finished him in the rematch. Chad Mendes was supposed to be too explosive. Edgar knocked him out in the first round. Cub Swanson, a dangerous striker with knockout power, Edgar submitted him in the final seconds of the fight. Frankie Edgar wasn't built like a champion. He wasn't the biggest, the strongest, or the hardest hitting. But what he had relentless movement that kept him out of danger. He had a chin that could absorb unreal amounts of damage. He had cardio that never faded. He had some of the best boxing fundamentals in the division. Sharp combinations, constant angles, and impeccable timing. He had footwork that left bigger guys swinging at air. And above all else, he had grit. That is why fighters today still talk about him with so much respect. Guys like Alexander Volkanovski, who also fights in a division where everyone is bigger than him, have called Frankie an inspiration. Dana White has called him one of the toughest fighters to ever step into the octagon. And when you look at his career, it's easy to see why. Not many fighters get to fight for 3 different UFC belts. Not many guys hold a title in a division where they never cut weight. And not many fighters redefine what it means to be an undersized champion. Hall of Fame is not even a question. Frankie Edgar is already a bona fide legend and a surefire Hall of Famer.
Frankie Edgar, of course. The
best. I love him. I love his family. A rough way to go out, but what he's accomplished here and what he's done, nothing but respect and sport.
He is the epitome of a champion.
This is about as clear of a Hall of Famer as a Hall of Famer gets.
Frankie, the answer, Edgar.
Fighting is a brutal sport. The bigger guy usually wins. The stronger guy usually dominates. But every once in a while, a fighter comes along who refuses to follow the rules. Frankie Edgar wasn't supposed to be a UFC champion. He wasn't supposed to beat BJ Penn. He wasn't supposed to survive Maynard. He wasn't supposed to spend years fighting guys who looked 2 weight classes above him. But he did. And he proved that size doesn't determine the heart of a champion. Now that he's retired, one question remains. Will we ever see another Frankie Edgar? Maybe. But the truth is, there will never be another fighter quite like him. As Frankie said himself, I wish I could do this forever. I enjoy training. I like the whole pursuit of a goal. You take that away, it's like, damn, what am I gonna do? But you know, I'll find something.
I wish I could do this forever, honestly.
Yes.
I enjoy training. I like the whole pursuit of a goal, I've been doing it since you're a kid. You're an athlete forever, and you take that, always trying to improve and get better and strive for something. You take that away, it's like, damn, what am I gonna do? But
And if you've ever doubted yourself, if you've ever felt too small, too weak, or too outmatched, just remember Frankie Edgar, because he is living proof that no matter how big the odds are stacked against you, you can still be great.
I think to be able to witness a lot of these fighters that are, they've really made a mark in the sport is awesome. And
Frankie's been in some awesome, amazing wars. The Gray Maynard fights that was crazy. Frankie's a man. I really got nothing to say other than he's a man. And every time he fights, he puts on a show. And
he's one of them, because he's definitely a legend. He was a legend in featherweight division and multiple divisions. But yeah, definitely a legend of the sport, and he's done some massive things. So yeah, very well deserved respect he has from everyone.
Wow. Yes, man. Frankie's always been the best. He's like, we always called him the little engine that could, because he was always too small. He never should have been a lightweight champion, but he was a lightweight champion, and he fought for the featherweight championship, and now he's a bantamweight, which is probably where he always should have been. And he's always been fun. He's always been exciting. He's always been a gentleman. It's the curtain comes down on all of them.